please tell us a bit about who you are and the work you do at Stand Up to Racism?
Yeah, so as I said, my name's Nahella and I work with Stand Up to Racism, and basically we were set up a couple of years ago at the back of a UN Day Against Racism. It's like an international day, and as well as organising, national demonstrations in London that are part of that National Day of Action, we also get involved in campaigning against other forms of racism. So whether it's state-based racism, so deaths in police custody, or whether it's supporting the refugees that are based in Calais, or any other form of racism that we come across, that's really what it's about, whether it's Islamophobia or campaigning against the new extremism bill and stuff like that.
Could you tell us about some of the issues, what you're covering at the moment?
So presently, obviously, one of the key things is drawing attention to what's happening in Calais. So there's about 6,000 refugees well, it's not even a refugee camp, it's basically what they're calling the jungle. It's not fit for anyone who's staying. It's cold, it's wet, there's no real shelter for people, and these people have left countries all around, possibly the Middle East, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, trying to escape war, and they've come with the hope of trying to get to England and be safe and live in dignity, and they're stuck in Calais.
What do you think is the most important action that needs to be taken now for the refugees in Calais?
So obviously the immediate thing is raising money so that we can take money over there and help the charities on the ground. But actually more important in the long run is to campaign against this tourist policy, which is to spend huge amounts of money building fences and keeping these refugees out. And actually what we should be saying is our country's rich enough to take these people in. We can accommodate these people, and we have to also take responsibility for some of the reasons why they're here. There's a war on in Afghanistan and Iraq. There's war on in other parts of the Middle East that we've helped create and fund, and I think we do have to take responsibility for the actions of those wars that we helped.
What kind of barriers are there to the work that you're doing in terms of like the recent events in Paris and around the Middle East, and how has that affected the work you're doing?
So I don't think the scaremongering that we're seeing around the bombings in Paris are helping. You see the huge media frenzy around this idea that they could be Syrian refugees. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea that the Syrian refugees were involved in what's happened in Paris, and even the Parisian authorities are saying that they weren't involved. But it doesn't stop the press from linking the two together. And so for a lot of people, this idea that Muslims means terrorism, or the refugees are somehow a danger to us, makes our work harder in the long run.
And it is especially difficult when as soon as an idea gets into the press, and it's hard to get rid of that idea once it's there.
Yeah, so even though the authorities have actually said no, it's not true, that they weren't refugees, it doesn't stop the press from printing the stories and then being constantly circulated, and it creates a sense of fear in society as well, which isn't helpful for anyone.
What does this mean for refugees, asylum seekers, migrants who are here now in the UK? What does that mean for their situation?
Well, I think they are seen or treated with more suspicion, which isn't helpful. These people are obviously in dire need in this country as well, and treated appallingly by the authorities. And the idea that they would somehow be threatened by racists in the streets or things like that is just not helpful or acceptable even.
So do you think that because of what's been happening in Calais, in Paris and around the Middle East, that there is going to be a rise in hate crime and incidences of hate crime in Manchester and the North West?
I think there will be. I mean, luckily in the past that we've been able to stop some more of these incidents, the fact that we've been able to push back organisations like the English Defence League and Britain First, but there's no denying the fact that what we've seen in Paris has resulted in people feeling more suspicious about Muslims and about refugees, and this idea of the other within society. And we have seen more attacks on individuals, in particular against women on out and about. And this isn't being out and about in dark corners late at night. We're talking about attacks very much out in the open on public transport.
What can ordinary British citizens, for example, or people who've been here for a while and have their status and everything, how can they help the situation?
So I think there is a responsibility amongst the general public to push back when stories like this do come out. I mean, it's really important for us to, when the press, a story that's going to incite racism or hatred or is just blatantly wrong, that we do complain about it. But more importantly, there's lots of other events that we can be involved in. So whether it's out demonstrating against a racist, or whether it's attending events and fundraising for the refugees, I think it's very important to do stuff like this.
In terms of how people should act if they see a hate crime or they experience a hate crime themselves, what would you recommend the action they take?
So I think it's very important that if you are a victim of hate crime, that hate crime is reported. And I understand why people don't do it, because obviously Lots of people don't trust the authorities right now. They don't feel that anything's going to change or anything's going to happen. But it's important that it's noted and that we hold our police force to account and, you know, say, what have you done about this? It's not acceptable that somebody should be attacked in their streets or going along their everyday life. And I think the only way that that can stop is to know that the police and the authorities will take it seriously, and actually the general public will take it seriously as well. So that if you are going to abuse someone on public transport in the street, you are going to be held to account and you are going to be reported to the police and you will be prosecuted.
How can we hold people like the media to account?
So obviously I know that there's ways of complaining about the media, so you can have a letters campaign or whatever, but the biggest thing is actually to not buy that media outlet. No, don't go buy that paper, boycott the paper. A really good example is this, what happened with the Sun in Liverpool, you know, when they wrote all those terrible lies about the Hillsborough fans. Up to this day, people in Liverpool don't buy the Sun. It's not delivered in Liverpool, it's not in any of the shops. And I think that's a really good example of, you know, the power that the public has.
Do you think that we would be able to put more pressure on news reporters, news outlets, media, businesses to have a greater responsibility with how they report incidences of hate crime or incidences of terrorism in terms of how that will affect the general public?
I think, yeah, we can, and we have to, when they get things wrong, raise our voices and say, look, this is wrong and it's not acceptable. But I think the other thing to bear in mind is the fact that, you know, social media has a massive influence on what people think and see and learn about these issues. So when the media goes on about stuff like, you know, there's been a passport found near one of the bombers in, you know, one of the attackers, a terrorist in Paris, the amount of people on social media that were saying, well, what? So he blew himself up and the passport survived. It's really interesting that, you know, the narrative that the media are trying to put out there can be countered by what's happening on social media. It's that independent media that's absolutely key. If we support our independent media and it sends a clear message to the establishment that we're not going to buy into their lies, we're not going to buy into their poor journalism. And I think that goes a long way to shifting things. So, for instance, even in this country, when you saw the refugee crisis first come into the media's attention and the public attention, that both the government and the mainstream press, and actually the mainstream press as well, they're very quick to say, oh, you know, they're not welcome in this country, we don't have room in this country and all the rest of it. And Cameron even went along as using the, you know, the really bad language, the foul language around, you know, swarms of refugees and stuff. And what's interesting is they've had to shift that line. Both the government and the media have had to, you know, shift that position because they can see that the British public, A, aren't buying into it, and B, don't share those views. So I heard a statistic the other day where 1 in 3 people have given to the refugees. That's a huge number. And it just goes to show the fact that, you know, regardless of the amount of, you know, filth that they print in their papers, the public are seeing through it. And I think at times like that, when even the people that run the newspapers start seeing how much support the refugee issue has got, they've had to shift, you know, the way they report things. I'm not saying they're great still. There's still a long way to go. But it's a massive improvement from what we heard initially.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I noticed is early on during the refugee crisis, you had a lot of right-wing papers that were saying like, oh, they're not really Syrians, like they're all from Africa and this kind of thing, as if that kind of justified not helping them.
Yeah.
But now this has happened in Paris and the Middle East, it's like, oh, they're all Syrian.
And they're all out here to somehow attack us, which is crazy because what we have to remind people of that, even if they were all Syrian in Calais, but they're not, but even if they were, the reason they are in Calais is because they've run away from ISIS, the very people that are attacking us, you know, here in, well, it attacked us in Paris. So, you know, if you stand up against ISIS and what's happening in Paris, then you have to stand with these refugees because these refugees are just as much a victim of ISIS as the Paris people were.
Do you think Islamophobia plays a key in how this is all being played out?
I do. I really do believe that, you know, the refugees have always been seen as the other. So it's harder to relate to those people and their, you know, the terrible situation there is. You can see the level of sympathy that was raised around the shootings in Paris. And quite rightly, what happened in Paris is devastating. And we're all, you know, completely glued to our screens. At the same time, we do have to recognise that the people coming out from the Middle East have just as much right to safety and dignity as the people in Paris and across the rest of the Western world. Because
these were the kind of events that they were experiencing nearly every day, and that's why they're here.
And it must be devastating for them to think, you know, we fled thinking we were going to come to a place of safety. Then we're, you know, almost imprisoned in this open camp in Calais, and now to find out that actually you're just not safe here either because ISIS can attack in France as well.
How does this mirror to events that took place in World War II regarding refugees trying to get out of Germany and Eastern Europe?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So we had a massive refugee issue at the end of the Second World War, but what's really interesting is even during that war, there were lots of European countries and actually the US that shut their borders and said, we don't want these refugees. I mean, kind of really famous stories of Anne Frank, which we all know about, a young girl who wrote a diary while she was first in hiding and then in a concentration camp, and she died in that concentration camp. Her and her family initially applied for a visa to go to the US, and that visa was denied. If she had got that visa, if they had managed to escape and had got to the US, she would be 77 years old today. And she would be alive. But because they decided that, she could be a German spy or something, or a Nazi spy, they didn't give her a visa. It's very similar to what we're seeing around the issue of the refugees in Calais presently. Refugees and the migrant community in Manchester have no responsibility for what's going on around the world, and especially what's going on in the refugee camp in Calais. They have gone through so much to come here, and they have a right to just quietly get on with their lives, and we totally understand that. I don't believe they have a responsibility to do anything. Our government need to take responsibility for the people of Calais. But actually one thing they could do, and I think is really useful, is to go out and tell their story. Because unfortunately it's true, I can talk about statistics as much as I want, but actually until you hear the story of someone who's made that journey across thousands of miles, who have got into this country and what they've gone through, it doesn't hit home. And I think so. The only message to any refugee here already, or anybody from the migrant here, we'd love to hear your story. And if you don't want to tell it, that's fair enough, and we totally respect that. But if you would like to come forward and tell your story, it would be wonderful, because I think people need to hear what you've gone through and to then understand that what you went through was terrible, but there are still people going through that today, and we should do all we can to stop that.
Do you have any other thoughts for how we can fight hate crime, not just against Islamophobia and against particularly refugees in Calais, but to all migrants who might be affected by what's going on?
So I do think we need to think about what's happening, and we need to take responsibility for the fact that there are so many refugees in the world. The other thing I think we need to do is accept that we have the facilities to help these people. We could open our borders and let 6,000 refugees in today, and it wouldn't be a problem for us. They are not to blame for what's happening with the lack of social housing, the lack of school places, the queues in the hospitals, any of that kind of thing. They are not responsible for it, and they shouldn't be held responsible. So I think the first thing to do is say, yes, we're responsible for some of the situation in the Middle East, and at the back of that we should be helping the people that at least got to Calais and want to come to Britain. That would go a long way, I think, to clearing some of the myths that we're seeing in the media and the lies that have generated and helped increase Islamophobia and other hate crime in Britain.
So what kind of actions are Stand Up to Racism currently taking?
So we've just done a delegation. So we took about 30 people from across Greater Manchester over to Calais to take solidarity and also to take well-needed aid over there. But since they've come back, obviously those individuals have been going out and talking about their experiences and, sort of almost telling witness stories about what happened and doing, photo displays of what they saw. We're also continuing obviously to fundraise, and one of the other key events we've got coming up is we've got a fundraiser on the 11th of December, which is a Friday. That's the 11th of December at 7 p.m. at the Nexus Cafe, and the hope is obviously to build the organisation, but also to collect money for the refugees so that we can go out in Calais, because there will be another delegation going on the 12th of December, which is the day after our social event. As long as we continue the fight against the lies that we get told about refugees, I think it could only be, we can only have a better society.